Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining. We're excited to have a great panel today. Some people on this panel have more experience with doing virtual panels. I'm not one of them, so we'll see how it goes, but thank you for Deeper Signals for taking a bet on me. And for organizing this, I'm really excited to hear from our group about self-awareness in kind of business and leadership. So here we go. So first of all, you have everyone's bios or links to their bios, but I'm going to do a brief overview of who everyone is. So first we have Lakshmi, who is former WeWork and Match.com and a brilliant thinker on workplace connection. So excited to have her here. We have Paul, who is, I think, a recovering lawyer turned businessman and founder of Shortlist that does focuses on talent, placement, acquisition, and training in Kenya and India. And then we have Tomas, who's a psychologist and the chief talent science officer at ManpowerGroup. And I just have to say the name of his book because it's so awesome. Why So Many Incompetent White Men Are Leaders, which says it all. So here we are. Before I start, just quickly, I'm excited to be here. My background is mostly in talent, both as an investor and working on talent development. And I've been thinking a lot about the future of work, and most of my investments align with the future of work. And one of the things that, certainly with COVID, but even before, we have this reality of, will there be jobs lost or jobs gained? But the reality is there will be jobs changed. And so as we look at automation and we think about what is going to shift most, I think that we are going to really focus on accentuating not what we used to in talent, which are skills around technical and physical labor, but much more skills around emotional, psychological skills. So this is what this panel is about. And I think it's the human side that we have an opportunity to really think about the human side of talent, and self-awareness is a huge piece of that. So I thought I might get started by reading a definition of self-awareness so that we're all on the same page, which when I read it, I think I knew what it was, but now I'm self-aware to know what it is. But it is the ability to focus on yourself and how your actions, thoughts, or emotions do or don't align with your internal standards. And if you're highly self-aware, you can objectively evaluate yourself, manage your emotions, align your behavior with your values, and correctly understand how others perceive you. So that was the definition that I pulled off the internet. So with that as our backdrop, I would be curious how the other panelists define or perceive self-awareness. Does this resonate with you, this definition? Do you see it somewhere else? And maybe I'll start off with Tomas because you're the psychologist, so you should definitely have a good definition of this.
Yes, so Blair, I didn't know that definition, but it's very good and it's very rich. I think you could almost read it very slowly, and there are so many components, right? Because you have the intrapersonal component, which you mentioned at the beginning, which is basically explore yourself via introspection. But at the end, you said the ability to know how others perceive you. And in psychology, historically, we've seen the two as interconnected in a healthy self-concept. Like the more your internal perception of yourself aligns with how people see you, probably the more effectively you can manage yourself and others in interpersonal relations. And I would say that to me, the kernel of self-awareness is self-knowledge. Do you know yourself, including your strengths and weaknesses? Do you know your limitations? Are you aware of what you don't know? I think if society transition from worshiping and celebrating self-confidence to valuing and nurturing self-awareness or self-knowledge, we will be in a much better place and we wouldn't have the problems that we have today. And I'll pause there because the audience can use their imagination for what problems I'm referring to.
Great. Lakshmi, do you want to add anything to that, particularly as you think about connection in the workplace?
Sure. Yeah. I like that definition. I think, as Tomas said, there's a lot in it. The way that I think about self-awareness is I ask people to notice what they notice. So why are you noticing what you notice? And what I like about that idea is it's very simple. It's a bit disarming. And it creates space for people to think about what do they pay attention to and what might they not be paying attention to. And so it creates sort of like a natural dialogue. And one of the first things I do when I'm building a team or getting to know somebody is I'll ask them, like, what do you tend to notice more than others? Or what do you pay attention to more than others? And that just gives me like a first portal into the lens through which that person sees the world. And it's a great way to sort of, like kick off both self-awareness and awareness of others. So I like sort of that pithy idea and then getting someone to locate it and then expanding from there.
Great. Love it. Paul, did you want to add?
It's hard to improve upon those two experts, but the thing I'd add is I think we're most interested in seeing how self-awareness shows up in the workplace through behaviors, through cultural and team practices. I think in general, we think of self-awareness as important on its own, but very much as the foundation to the other set of soft skills and behaviors and emotional intelligence that makes teams work well. And so when we're working with our own teams, when we're working with our clients, the young professionals who come to our platform, it's more about thinking through those practices you can inculcate into the day-to-day to make sure you're being more self-aware, moments of reflection, journaling, different practices that we work on to cultivate that.
Great. So let's jump into it. Obviously, I'm guessing all three of you think we can teach people self-awareness. So I'd be curious, in your work, how do you train people to be self-aware? What does that look like in each of your sort of infrastructures?
I would even think about the phrasing of that. I don't try to teach people self-awareness. I try to like inspire self-awareness and to model it. Mm. And I think that that's important so that it's a much more accessible concept. And so like just going back to that example that I opened up with, like I ask people, like what is something that you tend to notice more than others? And that immediately opens up a storytelling opportunity. So people will be like, I tend to notice traffic more than others, traffic patterns. I tend to notice the plants in a room when I walk in. I tend to notice what was the designer's intent in this room. How full is the coffee pot? Right. And so all of a sudden when you start to create an environment where people's perspectives are like acknowledged and valued and actually seen, and you're actually creating an environment people can see what other people see. That's when I think that you can inspire self-awareness rather than teaching it.
Do you have any examples within your context of where you felt like you did cultivate that and someone changed the way that they operated or the way that they managed or where they worked with a team? And we can come back to you if you want to give a moment of thought, but
Yeah, I'm going to defer to Paul and Tomas for a second. And then, I would love to answer that question.
Great.
Yeah, if I can answer the previous question, which I like a lot. I think, the main thing that people can do to improve their self-awareness is to become more open to feedback from others. And this seems really obvious, but a lot of the advice we hear, often popular advice, actually runs counter to that. When we hear, the type of self-help advice that encourages people to not worry about what others think of them, just be yourself. If you think you're great, you are. It's pretty narcissistic and actually makes people entitled and self-centered. I would like for people to be more open to others' feedback. There's a great line that various poets have used, something along the lines of, I exist in the eyes of others. And if we're open to that, I think you will learn something important about yourself. And I don't mean, how your mom or your dad thinks of you, or your favorite aunt, or, boyfriend or girlfriend or spouse, but most of the people who work around you. And the big opportunity for businesses, I think, is for leaders and managers to be a source of self-awareness or a source of feedback to others. This doesn't happen very often because many people are promoted into management or leadership roles without the right expertise and training, and because managers find it very uncomfortable to provide negative feedback to their employees. So they end up being kind of passive aggressive and, agreeing when they don't, and they think that they're being nice by doing this, but actually they're harming the development of their employees, which is why psychometric assessments have become so ubiquitous as a third party or data-driven source of feedback because leaders and managers are not providing employees with that feedback.
Yep. And I want to get in specifically to the technical question of how do you do this. And what I'm interested in probably is more of a venture investor is like, how do you do it at scale, which of course Deeper Signals is trying to do. But Paul, did you want to jump in and?
Yeah, sure. And I think starting to get into the question of scale, first off, I love the prior two comments. I think it's more about inviting opportunity, self-awareness, and creating situations where that can be exercised rather than teaching someone. I love the idea of connecting more to what other people, how other people see you, because that feels like it's often the missing part of self-knowledge. I think what we've been experimenting with is how do we cultivate more self-awareness and self-discovery across our base of young professionals. We've got a community of 1 million young professionals and in India, in East Africa. And oftentimes the way local educational systems work, there's not the same level of engagement. They're a little bit more based on rote memorization. And so what we're trying to do is use the power of digital and content to reach a much broader set of people with more standardized exercises and tools that can take people on a journey of self-discovery as a prelude to starting to uncover what jobs are out there, how do I get those jobs, and then how do I use the knowledge I have about myself to go through the personal branding and job search process to both find a job that's a better fit. And that's a process I'm sure many people can reflect on. You mentioned, I mean, I started in advertising. I was a corporate lawyer. As you know, I was in India for several years, and before starting this company, there's a process that I think can take people on that if the foundation is there with self-understanding and self-awareness, a lot of great things can be built on top of that. So I'd be happy to talk more about that, but starting to get into that scale question, I think is really powerful. We use Deeper Signals. It's been an incredible tool. We've had tens of thousands of young people get access to that tool here. And those tools are probably not the answer, but they're a great starting point to start to prompt those conversations and discovery of what's out there. What do I do with this?
Great. So let's, and I know, Lakshmi, I asked you about like a specific example, and I'm curious, but well, maybe if you want to jump in later with that, but let's get into the specific tools. Like what, I remember, and whatever, a decade or two ago, it was like, okay, every quarter, let's sit down with your goals. And like, you fill out this like Word document with your goals. And then like a quarter later, you go back to your manager and they'd be like, did you meet these goals? I mean, we're beyond that. At least I would hope, although I'm sure a lot of companies are still doing that. And sorry if everyone on this call is, but let's talk a little bit about like, what are these, like Tomas, you talked about these psychometric tools. What are they? Why are they better? And yeah, so, and then.
Yeah. So I think there are 3 types of tools. One is no tool at all, which is just people's curiosity, inquisitiveness, and having, sufficient levels of self-criticism to explore what others think of you. And I think everyone in this meeting, our audience, can think probably about specific examples where they received feedback from others that was a little bit uncomfortable, but life-changing in a way, when they told you something that made you experience an uncomfortable gap between the person who you want to be and the person others saw. And so, let's not forget that feedback as an organic kind of tool that doesn't require data, AI, or psychometric assessments is very valuable. And if we look at Amy Edmondson's work on psychological safety, why is it becoming so important now? Because we're learning that if leaders create a climate where people provide and receive feedback, their team more creative, more effective, etc. On the side of the actual tools, I think you have what we would consider kind of active surveys, which ask questions to others that can be aggregated around, I think you mentioned, Blair, in the beginning, the soft skills, or now they're also called power skills because they're so important and hard to nurture. But things, like your level of ambition, curiosity, intelligence, the stuff that determines what you can learn and what your potential fit is to certain jobs, which I'm sure Paul can speak to, and the work he's doing. And these are basically science-based, non-intrusive, proven, well-established methods to compare yourself to others and basically tell you what you're like. And they've been around for 50 years, but we've seen a lot of innovation in the last 10 years trying to improve the user experience, the candidate experience, by making them shorter, more engaging, and almost like nudge style, in which, you know, in the sense that I can give you questions here and there as opposed to a 300 survey like what you described.
Sure.
And I think in the future, we will see more passive data being used. Imagine, for instance, if we could somehow synthesize or stitch together all the information that exists on you in cyberspace or out there, and you know, kind of synthesize this and tell you what that says about you. You know, imagine if we could put together your Spotify music preferences, Netflix, etc., and we tell you, look, this actually tells the algorithms or AI out there that you are like this, and here's something you can learn about yourself. We're not at that stage, and mostly these efforts fall under the kind of creepy AI category because people are a little bit scared even when they hear about it. But I think it's the future, and it will come. And I think it's only fair, with all the data we've relinquished and given away already, that some of that data is returned to us, and in the form of a deeper understanding of ourselves, you know, which, by the way, now not even Amazon or Netflix, these companies don't really know who you are. They know what you bought or what you watch, but imagine a situation where you inject psychology to this data, black box models, and we can tell you, this is the digital Blair. And, you know, by the way, if you don't like it, maybe you shouldn't watch Tiger King so much.
Right. Well, I don't watch Tiger King, just so. Well, I want to get into the creepy AI stuff because I'm very intrigued by that, particularly like how these algorithms work and what you said. Lakshmi, you were at WeWork and Match.com. Like, let's talk about like how did this play in those particular companies? I would just be curious.
Yeah. So actually, at Match.com, I was on the events in person. Things. So while I worked with product, so in a way, what I was dealing with was people actually growing fatigued of everything being driven by algorithms and everything being about data, and people kind of wanting to go back to sort of like the magical, immeasurable aspects of meeting in person. So that's the part of the business that I worked on. And then when I came to WeWork, my charge was to bring sort of the lessons from the dating world into the workplace, because there's a lot of application for how people get to know each other in a dating scenario. And one of the things I always say is that we're all dating all the time. Dating is not just something that single people do. It's something that everybody does, because it's just the act of getting to know other people. So I would say I was much more on the sort of analog side of things. I mean, I obviously had to interface with, you know, assessment tools that were being brought in, and different ways that people, you know, wanted to sort of measure everyone. And honestly, I'm very conflicted about it. I have mixed feelings about the entire process. I think they serve a purpose and a role. I think when they are sort of dropped in by an external consultancy, sometimes they can wreak more havoc than good. But I do see their purpose, but I'm very much about sort of community building practitioners working in conjunction with assessments to make sure that they don't become a proxy for trying to get to know people.
And Paul, how does this play off? You said you could mention more tools. How does this play out in Shortlist?
I think in a few, yeah, a few different ways. In general, we sometimes use AI in our marketing pitches, but I think our focus is less about having computers replace the role of humans and more about using technology to try to scale human interactions. And I think we could go in a lot of directions, because we are doing some, I think, very interesting things about collecting new forms of data to help match people to careers more efficiently. But as it relates to self-awareness in general, I think it's less about AI and it's more about using tech to democratize access to self-awareness and professional development tools that are now more broadly accessible to anyone. So a lot of what we're thinking about are taking the different coaching experiences or content or self-awareness processes that many of us have had the benefit of going through. We always talk about one of our co-founders, Matt, is a self-described professional development junkie. And he was fortunate enough to sell a company and just take a couple of years to just go to all of the Tony Robbins, become a licensed Google search inside yourself trainer, go on meditation journeys. And one of the things we reflected upon is he was lucky to be able to go and experience that firsthand, spend the money on it. But we can package and curate a lot of the similar kinds of experiences for people to take in a more self-guided way. And so what we're particularly excited about are essentially choosing and curating a best of those experiences for the young professionals on our platform and currently giving it away for free. And that includes, for example, the Deeper Signals psychometric, but that also includes a range of other skill assessments. It includes a number of coaching exercises to go through an inventory of yourself and what you're good at and what you like doing and what situations wake you up and bring you alive. It includes things like the Wheel of Life as a way to start jarring some of those recognitions about what's important to you and where things are going. So would be happy to talk more about the role of AI. Certainly, I think it has some exciting applications in the world of talent matching and career matching and the personalization of content recommendations and things like that. But we're thinking even more basic than that. How do we make sure that the 1 million+ people on our platform can get access to the best in world stuff, even if they didn't get to grow up in San Francisco and experience really cool things?
Yeah, yeah. And I love this from from the perspective, even as I think about like the world of talent and like, you know, historically talent and human resources, which my father was in corporate America doing this, was basically they did benefits and labor negotiations. That's what my dad did for companies. And obviously now HR is becoming much more, it's in the C-suite, you know, we're very strategic. We have this data, we have analytics, we can just think so differently about how we manage talent, which is fascinating to me. The second piece that I'm very excited about is that, you know, I guess I would ask the question to you guys is that, you know, people are transitioning at paces we've never seen before. This is partially because you have a lot of people who decide I want passion and purpose, Gen Z in my job, and I want to be here, so I'm going to last, you know, 2 years. But now we have situations like obviously what is happening and the just massive job loss around the world because of the economy and infrastructure. How does these kind of assessments, the ability to give people access to kind of self-awareness and understanding their skills, how does this help with this sort of transition economy that we're in?
Well, you know, this is a big question, right? But I think the first thing to understand is that technology has enabled us to scale the science in an unprecedented way. Because before, you know, assessments were very exclusive, complex, expensive. Now we have the opportunity to democratize feedback. And if you do that, you know, we will boost people's understanding of their potential and their own talents. Talent is becoming increasingly complex. Before, I look at a resume and I know this is the job for you, and there's 3 things you can do, and that's it. And you made that decision 10 years ago and you can't change. What's changing now, Blair, is that the world of talent is increasingly more complex and also more fluid. Just pay attention to the current situation where a lot of people are in lockdown having to reimagine their careers because industries are disappearing. And so it would not take too much for a well-designed tool to improve that person's own understanding of their potential and self-awareness. And I never thought that maybe with my interests, values, drivers, and style, I could easily upskill or retrain to become this. So think about the opportunity to unlock talent at scale. That's really what excites me the most.
And do you feel like employers, and this is for anyone, so I'm self-aware, I know what I'm good at, that helps me better, you know, find the right job for me? How are employers matching with the individual self-awareness, particularly as they transition?
Well, I think there's a fair amount of confusion on the employer side as well. because I think a lot of organizations don't understand their people's potential. You know, they still operate in this world where talent was mostly equated to hard skills, your profession, your qualifications, and that is being disrupted right now. You know, so I think the crisis of understanding is twofold. Organizations don't understand people and their potential, and they have under-leveraged resources internally, go for the wrong talent for the wrong positions externally, overpay, etc., which is why a lot of people don't enjoy where they end up. And employees don't understand their potentials. That's where technology and science can unite. And I agree with Lakshmi, you still need human expertise to make the most of any tool. You know, you can't just in a kind of Tinder-like or Match.com-like way saying, you know, you should hook up with this person or marry that person, or you should watch this movie or listen to this thing. So because talent is much more complex than, you know, a meal in a restaurant.
Yeah. Well, so Lakshmi, I want to bring you in, but so I've been reading this book called The Carpenter and the Gardener. It's like how you raise kids. And basically the carpenter is like, you want it to be this perfect statue. And so you like wield your kids to be this perfect statue. And the gardener is like, you plant the garden and you see what happens. You thought it was gonna be a red rose, but oh wow, it's white, or whatever it is. And you sort of create this open space. And Lakshmi, when I said you teach, you sort of corrected me and said, no, you create an environment. So I hear that. But when you're working in a business world and you've got like multiple personalities who now are all self-aware of what their skills are, they're not, like, how do you build teams where you can sort of let all the flowers bloom, or how do you kind of structure so that that can happen in an organizational environment where it's, you know, it's extremely challenging to just like unlock all this potential and manage it, quote unquote. So I'd be curious what you think, Lakshmi.
Yeah, I mean, one thing is that I think it's an ongoing process. So I know you didn't ask this. It's just it illustrates one of the things that I push against a lot is when people ask for tips and tricks. Because what I hear when people ask for tips and tricks is that they want an easy solution to something that is an ongoing process, and as to your point, like quite complex. So yeah, I mean, with that, it's I think it's a responsibility at all levels of the organization. But from where I sit and where my lens is very focused is, how are we dimensionalizing all of the people that we are around, that we work with? That we are not just reserving our get to know you moments for happy hours and expensive offsites, but how are we making the process of getting to know each other an ongoing practice? And so, yeah, that may mean everything from, you know, how we do our social gatherings, to making sure we establish a set of team norms, to understanding what everybody pays attention to understanding everyone's origin story and how they got to the company and how they got to the role. There are so many different things that you can do, but all of these things have to work together. And like I said, it's a plan. And usually for me, it's a very sort of bespoke plan. And I wanted to, if you don't mind, I wanted to sort of address the question before, really about the changing workforce. And I totally agree with Tomas. And one of the things that I'm paying a lot of attention, I was a restaurant worker for almost a decade before I went corporate and started, you know, having insurance and walking into a building with endless office supplies. But, you know, like right now, like there's an entire workforce, retail workers, restaurant workers, much broader than that. And, you know, we really do need to understand that those are not just, you know, those aren't just like hard labor skills. The skills that are developed in those professions are extremely nuanced, have incredible ability to convert, but it's going to take a minute for people to understand that. Yep. And that it is not just hard work to be in these professions. There's an incredible amount of intelligence that is acquired in all these professions that we've sort of put in a box. And how do we find a space for them in this economy?
I could not agree more. I was a waitress for a decade too, through business school, undergrad, all of that. And I learned, I think, how do you manage multiple tables at a time? How do you navigate, how this person wants me to talk to them, this person doesn't. I mean, the skills I think are important, and how do we find those skills, to your point, Tomas, of what they are, and transition them into new roles that are emerging. Paul, did you want to? Yeah.
And just to that point, Blair, in a way, you know, you never know really if you're made for a job or not until you do it. You never know, you know, and but there are ways to predict, and there are ways to evaluate the probability, and that's what this science is about, right? If you think about probability as a science of modeling uncertainty, we can basically tell you relatively quickly what your level of fit or interest is for a certain job, including for jobs that don't exist today.
Yep.
Because we say, well, if the component of creativity is this, then yes. If it's more about being diligent and so forth.
Paul, you wanted to jump in?
Yeah, and I love this. There's almost two ideas. I'll just try to pick one to respond to, but I do love the idea of talking through how self-awareness plays itself out through your career journey, so that the self-awareness up front to know which jobs to pursue and then get those jobs by branding yourself and pursuing. There's a whole strand there. But I really love where you're going about the interplay between team culture and performance and self-awareness, because I do really think self-awareness is that foundation to all of the other soft skills or emotional intelligence. And one of the things I know, we kind of treat our team, my team probably hates this, but we often treat our team like a guinea pig for cultural experiments and whatnot. I think there's direct practices teams can play around with to try to cultivate more intentionality and more self-awareness. We will very frequently, particularly at leadership retreats, but even in team meetings, pause for 5 to 7 minutes of free writing and journaling as a way to make sure it's not just who are the quickest people to put their hand up, but rather the people with the real ideas. We'll often pause meetings midway to go a few minutes of journaling. We promote within the team more mindfulness practices. For a long time in our India office, we actually had a meditation room, which was not often used for meditation, but occasionally. And we do wellness Wednesday sessions on that. But I do think that cultivating that self-awareness and that empathy is really foundational to teams working well together, no matter the actual organizational context. There's, I think Tomas mentioned the concept of psychological safety before. There's been a lot of research, the way that consistently across teams, that is one of the single greatest predictors of whether teams will be performing. Google invested millions in this Aristotle project several years ago. And after trying to figure out how it was team performers and whatnot that would predict performance, it ultimately boiled down to different metrics of psychological safety. Did people take turns talking? And was there a higher than average social sensitivity in that group? So I do think that creating these practices at a team level that flow from the values you set as a company, and in fact, one of our 5 values is act with intention, which was literally stated to run counter to Zuckerberg's move fast and break things. We were kind of like, we're older, we're slower, we like to take our time and get things right. But that was also about reflection, down to culture virtues, kind of the behaviors that define the day-to-day, and then the practices of how you cultivate that, because I really do think self-awareness and team culture are processes, not destinations.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was interesting, you mentioned empathy in relationship to self-awareness, which when I read this definition for the first time that I mentioned in the beginning of the call, you don't necessarily have to be empathetic to be self-aware. You just have to know how, like, for example, there's a lot of leaders out there who are self-aware and they know how others perceive them and they don't care, right? And they keep operating the way. I mean, empathy is a different kind of skill, which is like you're willing to be open to other people's opinions. You want to understand from their perspective, and you're trying to kind of, I think, in some ways morph to them. So, you know, in that context, and in the world we're living in, which is very much how do we build more diverse teams? How do we create different types of cultures that are more open and more inclusive? How do you think self-awareness fits into that? And maybe, Lakshmi, I'll ask you only because you workplace connection. What does that mean to, so how do you see self-awareness interplay in that way?
Self-awareness interplay, I'm sorry, what?
In terms of diversity and inclusion.
Yeah. Well, I think, like I said, I'm focused on the part on the, I always say I'm focused on the inclusion part of diversity and inclusion. So when I think about us bringing all of these different people together, that's great. But then how do you weave all of those people together, and how do you integrate them, and how do you make sure that the only time that we're not talking about diversity and appreciating each other's diversity is in a diversity workshop? So how does that become a part of like how we socialize, how we eat, how we greet people, how we run our offsites, how we run our, our all hands meetings. So that's the piece that I'm very like focused on and concerned on. And so like, for instance, like right now, people are talking a lot about like, onboarding new employees. How do you keep people connected? How do you keep people, still getting to know each other in the ways that are necessary in this new configuration? Mm-hmm. And so that is what I care about. That's what I'm paying attention to. Mm-hmm. And that to me is such an important part of the diversity equation.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm looking a little bit at the chat too, and there's some questions around what are these ideal traits that employers are looking for from a soft skills point of view, or I'm going to call them power skills, Tomas, because I like that better. And how are you selecting for those? I'll ask Tomas or Paul because both of you are.
Yeah, so I have a pretty quick answer. I think first of all, the only way to provide a generalizable answer is to accept that what we're talking about here are foundational employability skills or soft skills, right? So imagine that other things being equal, employees are generally better off if they are smarter, if they are more empathetic or more likable, and if they are more driven. But self-awareness is the only mechanism that enables them to understand where they are on these three first skills. And that's where you need to get them into the habit of collecting feedback, gathering feedback, or provide them with tools that democratize that feedback and improve their self-awareness. I also think that you can talk about different power skills or foundational skills for leadership. Things like, curiosity, humility, resilience, integrity, all of those things that every leader in the world is famous for today, particularly if they're running countries.
Mm-hmm. Paul, do you have a?
Yeah, I don't have a lot to add. I do think it's context dependent. I will say though that across the thousands of placements we've done, we do see consistently these power skills coming up in one form or another. And I think up there, of course, are things like teamwork, communication, creativity, a mindset that is more growth oriented and a sense of they can control the situation and can change outcomes, proactivity. So I think we see some consistencies. They are hard to measure, and I think it is something that we're working on, and we see things changing over time. We recently looked back at the people that have recently in the last 2-3 months taken the psychometric test, the deeper signals test. And it's been interesting to see the way that people under 3 years of experience, by some distance, the greatest category, the defined category is project manager. It's more about getting tasks done and things like that. But that the people that we have scored with 8+ years experience, they're more mid-career, possibly more in a managerial role. The shift towards empathy and empathizer, someone aware of the team's feelings and bringing people together is much, much higher. I'm not actually sure if that means that is a learned skill. People are developing that muscle essentially to get better in their career, or if it's more an indicator of like seniority or something like that. But I do think monitoring those is unique. I do think that using standardized tests can help, but we're still, I think it's still something we assess situation by situation.
Yeah, I'd be curious, just a stereotype, a lot of people would say women are more self-aware, that, they're much more empathetic, or that they're stronger in the softer skills. And I'm throwing this out there as just one example. Do you see trends or in the data, as you guys are all focused on data, what types of people are more self-aware? And that could be across gender or race, or it could be the kinds of educations or the kinds of environments that they grew up in that may cultivate this environment. So for example, I would definitely say culturally, I've worked in certain cultures where they're just waiting for you to tell them what to do, right? That's just what the culture, and that doesn't mean necessarily that they're not self-aware, but have you seen any patterns or any interesting things that would be worth mentioning around this?
Yeah, so the general trend is for the potential for self-awareness to be higher for people who show more empathy, who have a habit for introspection, who are more humble, more self-critical, because actually, contrary to popular belief, humanity is not underconfident, it's mostly overconfident. Most people think too highly of themselves. So, and that's more common in men than in women. So on average, women do have a stronger tendency or more potential for self-awareness than men. And I say this on average, much like, you know, height is on average, you know, men are taller than women on average, which doesn't mean that every man in the world is taller than every female. And this is something that sometimes even traditional feminists get upset by when you say, you know, women are more self-aware, they're more empathetic, they're more kind and caring. But that's what the data suggests, you know. And again, some men have higher femininity than some women, and some women are more traditionally masculine, right? So I think it's more about femininity, masculinity as two continuum or quantitative variables, but on average, women are more self-aware than men.
Lakshmi or Paul, any interesting trends or perspectives on this?
I would say a couple things. I don't have any data on this in particular in terms of trends. A couple things. One is that I think I continue to be encouraged by the fact that a lot of this is learnable. So one of my big takeaways always when reading, say, literature around growth mindset is that people come in and they may have a fixed mindset or growth mindset, but if you go through a training, you actually can evolve that and kind of recenter your locus of control. So the fact that these are not fixed, I think, is encouraging. I also think more in the job search process, there's been interesting data, not our data, about how men, by and large, will be more likely to apply to jobs they have no business applying to. And whereas women, perhaps because of self-awareness, and again, in aggregate, will often self-select out prematurely in some cases. And there's been a number of studies around that. I think we've also seen just the shift to a digital application process has been seen to be more inclusive. We ran a study with Harvard a couple years ago where in a job market like India, where generally the split, the workforce split is about 80% men to 20% women, or 75% men to 25% women, and depends who you ask. What we've seen is that by opening it up to a process that is more objective and seen to be more transparent and fair, we saw application rates that were more about 54% men, so there still is a difference, but 46% women. And what was most encouraging was the way they performed similarly through the process. So it's not exactly the same as self-awareness, but I do think when you think about job search and job outcomes, which are critically important, getting more people to, at the start, opt in an equal manner, I think is a critical part of the inclusion equation.
Absolutely.
Yeah, one thing that I've observed in it, it's more anecdotal and recent, but I think there's something significant here, is I feel like before self-awareness was sort of the domain of, you know, people who may have felt marginalized or not seen. And so self-awareness was like part of their survival. I have to understand how I'm perceived in order to be accepted in these, you know, primarily, you know, white patriarchal frameworks. And this is the first time where I've seen a shift to the majority, maybe being a little bit more self-aware, like how do I play a role in this system? And how have I, you know, unknowingly or knowingly created this system that has marginalized others? So I think that the onus of self-awareness has often been on people that were not included. And now I think I see a shift in self-awareness to the people who created these systems to begin with.
Yeah, I love that point, and I completely agree. And particularly as an investor, and I think about unlocking talent, and we talk about the importance of soft skills, particularly as we move forward and a lot of things become automated. The businesses that are going to thrive are the businesses that are finding this talent who actually have the skills. Like a lot of people are saying, oh, we don't have a lot of soft skills. I'm like, well, half the population, you know, if you go towards these stereotypes, that a lot of people actually do have these skills, but they haven't been prioritized in the workplace. And so the question is, how do we find ways to make that happen? I want to go back to the AI question a little bit, and maybe, you know, the potential dangers or opportunities there. And I'll start with you, Tomas. So, I mean, we've all heard these stories of like who is doing the programming makes a difference in how those programs get set. So Tomas, can you talk just a little bit about your observations around this, particularly as it relates to possible negative implications of these kinds of tools?
So I think that there are double standards, because there's no question that the AI-based tools can be biased, and the technical term here would be have adverse impact if you use algorithms to screen out certain traits or certain people. There's no question that you can end up with some groups that are harmed, marginalized, underrepresented, and some overrepresented. But firstly, that doesn't have to do so much with the prejudices or biases, conscious and unconscious, of the programmers. It's not like they're coming up with a conspiracy, secret plot to kind of harm anyone who isn't a middle-aged white male engineer. But it has to do more with the training models and the data that is fed into the algorithms. If you are asking AI or algorithms to predict who gets promoted in an organization, they will probably select middle-aged white male Protestant engineers or coders, because that's what's happening. Now, if you don't use AI, those people are still promoted in that organization. Right. And I also think there's double standards, because people get very shocked when there is a case of an algorithm, leading to overrepresentation or underrepresentation of certain groups, and everyone is happy with the status quo, which is pervasive bias in human interviewing, people relying on their prejudice, intuition all the time. It's almost like people are happy to be discriminated against by a human in an interview, but the thought that an algorithm might make a mistake is shockingly unacceptable. So it's very interesting, because, and I'm not saying I'm not naive or overly optimistic. We have to be very careful, and luckily there are ethical and scientific parameters that should be applied to these algorithms and AI to regulate them and ensure that they work in an accurate and fair way. But what I'm saying is that people are not sufficiently critical with the status quo. It would not take too much to improve over what we have right now, and so that's basically my position.
Yep. Lakshmi or Paul, do you share the position, or do you have any different perspectives on that?
I'm happy to share. I think I mostly agree. Tomas points out one of the foundational challenges we have using AI in our space is that algorithms are going to be inherently looking backwards. They're going to be pattern matching to probably the status quo, and the status quo in many places is uneven and unfair. I think we saw that with Amazon, when Amazon tried to use an algorithm to select the right people for their jobs, and not surprisingly, it tried to match to the composition of its current workforce, which is not equal in certain ways. So I think that, yeah, there are problems. The other problem I would mention, particularly in our contexts in East Africa, in India, is just the paucity of data. Like, we just don't have a lot of information. And so the limits of algorithm, it's kind of a garbage in, garbage out scenario. And I think this is an important thing to think about in a world where opportunities are allocated largely on the basis of things like where you went to school, maybe what your first job was. And there are injustices everywhere, but I think we certainly see it in our markets, Kenya, India, whether you went to a good school is often more a function of which family you were born into than your actual inherent potential. And so I know that as we start to think about it, and this was kind of in some ways the genesis for Shortlist, was how do we start building in a holistic picture of these young professionals that goes beyond just the CV? And I can tell you, we're doing certain things. We're using different kinds of tests, different kinds of interest questionnaires, work styles, but we still have a long way to go before we're going to be in a position where we can truly hone in at someone's potential rather than just letting these surface characteristics dictate who gets selected for these different things.
Mm-hmm. Great. I'm going to take a few questions from the chat. I've just been looking. One was, particularly as we move to a a distributed, more at-home work culture. How does this impact self-awareness? Is self-awareness much more important? How do you see it sort of playing out as we sit in our homes and stare at our screens?
I think it becomes more important and more difficult because you have no one around you. Like, right now I'm trying to be self-aware and I can see all of you nodding, but I know that you're being polite, but it's harder to even know if you're being genuine or not because you're not there, and you're looking at a screen and probably multitasking. So it becomes more awkward, more difficult. Things are lonelier. And also you need to reimagine how you operate and do your job. So you need to rethink your talent and your potential. So more important and more challenging, I would say.
Mm-hmm.
I don't have much to add to that. Yeah. So, go ahead, Lakshmi.
I was just going to go back to, I'm sort of taking what I said at the beginning, which is like to notice what you notice. And your answer to that, people's answer to that question is probably very different now. And so there's a whole new set of reflexes being developed, a whole new set of triggers, a whole new set of joys and moments where, things are, where you do feel connected. So just, we know, like, I always say, like, when you're in the pre-COVID world, if you had to go to like a work happy hour, you kind of know how you're going to operate. If you're going to be that person that stays till the end, if you're going to be that person that drinks a seltzer and leaves. And now you just have to know the equivalent of that in this new world. So just sort of like, I just ask you to just pay attention to what's bothering you, what is making you feel more connected, and then try and amplify the connected moments and try and reconfigure the moments where you don't feel connected.
Mm-hmm. Great. Love that. I was just thinking about that for myself in terms of what has changed, doing these Zoom meetings. And, I've found that in some ways, when you're just like, when you're on a one-on-one meeting, you're just like, you do have to be sort of razor focused. There's no distractions. You can't look to the side. You can't look. There's a level that I think, I don't know if it goes to self-awareness, but it's certainly sort of a focus and a connection that it's different. And it makes you perceive yourself differently and how you interact with someone differently. Would be one thing. And the second thing is, I find it interesting that you can set a tone, and a lot of people have been asking questions about what does this mean for leadership, even at, the tops. And I've found, being a part of different calls, that someone can really share an emotional story or a very personal story. And I think we're all sharing emotional stories just by the nature of our backgrounds. If you are having backgrounds that are not, preset, that there's a different kind of connection that can happen. So I'd be curious, just to take it up to the leadership question, what are we seeing from the leaders of this time in terms of self-awareness? Who are you seeing out there that is modeling this in a way that you think is representative of what we would hope from our leaders today? Oh, long pause.
It's a good question. Blair, you mentioned my book. So my position is that it's really, really hard to come up with examples of famous leaders, particularly in politics, who are a bastion of self-awareness. I always default to Angela Merkel because I think you have, she epitomizes a kind of rational, composed, objective, data-driven leadership style, where she takes on information, adjusts her behavior, is increasingly non-ideological, and knows her strengths and her limitations. And if you see how she dealt with the recent crisis, while everyone was parading, politicking, she took a while to come out, spoke for 10 minutes, came up with a plan, said, if it doesn't work, we're going to correct and adjust. This is serious. And then just look at how her group stood apart compared to most other big countries.
Yeah. Yep.
So I've been paying sort of less attention to like the current leadership across and what are they doing, and more who's showing up as a leader right now that kind of came out of the woodwork and is, and in a lot of organizations I hear about people that, again, like a skill set that wasn't appreciated is suddenly appreciated now. And are those people being championed? Are those people being elevated? So I'm looking at that question, but I'm kind of looking at it from a slightly different angle, because the leaders that we have now, you know, you have to wonder, like, with all of the awareness that's being built, you know, they played a role in that. And so I'm sort of watching, like, who are the new leaders that are emerging out of this.
And are there any that come to mind?
There are a ton of, I think, actually incredible voices on LinkedIn. That you know, if you look at their profiles, they don't necessarily hold leadership positions in their organization.
Right.
But wow, are they articulating things that you would hope a leader is thinking about?
So we're all going to follow Lakshmi on LinkedIn, because you're going to.
It's not me. Follow the people I follow.
Okay. Follow people. That's what I meant. No, we're going to see whose voices you amplify. So we have only 3 minutes left. So kind of in this vein of, like, specifics around, like, are there leaders you recommend? I always find it super helpful when you ask what are books you recommend, or, given we're talking about assessment tools, like, are there tools that you recommend? So I'm happy to start on the tool side. While there are a lot of interesting assessments, I think journaling, Paul, which you mentioned, is, like, one of the best tools. If you allow yourself to write in a truly authentic, honest way. I had a friend the other day who said he would write to, like, his later self. Okay, so I'm not talking about that. Like, write to, you know, what you think. And from a book, there were a bunch of things in the chat also about, like, how do you develop a growth mindset? And there is a book called Growth Mindset, right? I think that's what it's called, which actually is a very good book to help you kind of understand how to think about expanding your mind in that way. And so I would turn it to the others to share their perspectives. Lakshmi, do you want to go first? You look like you had
a book, and then, like, a practice.
Yeah, a tool, quote unquote, that would work, or a practice, and then a book that you would recommend.
Sure. I'm a big fan of Mike Rose, who's at UCLA. He wrote The Mind at Work.
Okay.
I love that book because it opens with a tribute to his mother, who was the waitress, and his uncle, who was a plumber, and about how they were appreciated for their hard work, but not for their intelligence. And so it's a beautiful examination of the different kinds of intelligence that exist across the job spectrum, and how important it is that we appreciate and acknowledge those.
Love it.
And then in terms of a practice, I have quite a few, but just for the purpose of this, one of the questions I love to ask my in a dating context, when I worked in dating and now in the workplace, is I love to ask people, what's something that people might assume about you? It's great because it's a way to have a conversation about assumptions, but one where someone is taking control of that narrative. Mm-hmm. And they're able to say, people assume that I am X, or that I do X. Mm-hmm. And it's a wonderful question that breeds storytelling and connection, and can really set the stage for a great team dynamic.
I love that. Paul, do you want to jump in?
Sure. Yeah. Great question. Got several, but if I pick one of each, on the book side, I'd probably recommend a book called Culture Code by a guy named Daniel Coyle. And he talks about what I almost think of as the meta culture of teams. What are those, no matter the team context, what are those meta behaviors that teams often engage that makes them perform at their best and makes the whole greater than the sum of the parts? It's things like psychological safety, sharing vulnerability, establishing purpose. Love the book, check it out. In terms of practice, there's a lot of great ones. You kind of mentioned journaling and morning pages. Something that occasionally I found very helpful to recommend people who maybe feel stuck in their careers or not sure where to go is something, I call it the genius exercise. I'm not even sure where it came from, or I'm sure it's some established thing, but essentially trying to bucket out the things you do day to day into kind of the zone of incompetence, the zone of competence, the zone of excellence, and the zone of genius. And like, no question that if you've got a lot of things in the zone of incompetence, like things you just are bad at, you should change. Competence, kind of like you're okay at it, but you just really, really don't want to do it. And a lot of people in their careers get stuck in the zone of excellence. It's something they're really good at, but it doesn't wake them up inside. It doesn't get them really excited, and they don't know how to start transitioning into that genius, that the thing you would do for free. And I found that as an exercise, it's something you can do in 15 minutes, but as an exercise of self-reflection that you can then use with a friend, with a coach, with a colleague, to then start to draw out some actionable insights. I've always found that really useful.
Love that. Tomas, do you want to finish us off?
Yeah, very quickly. So for books, the best book I read recently is Yuval Harari's 21 Lessons for the 21st Century. And, so the guy who wrote Homo Deus before and Homo Sapiens, but the last one encapsulates all the good bits from the previous ones. So Yuval Noah Harari, 21 Lessons for the 21st Century, brilliant. And it covers psychology, AI, education, the world, and what is to come. And for tools, the most important tool is self-awareness. So use and develop that muscle. 2 simple exercises: write down 3 words that you think encapsulate how other people see you, and then ask them to describe you in 3 words, and then see if that matches. And then think about what fact about you would most surprise others, because that will reveal something that might be accurate, but you're not using in your self-presentation, and you're maybe keeping close or hidden. So the main tool is self-awareness, and I think that's quite topical given the discussion we just had. Perfect.
Well, thank you everyone for participating, and to Deeper Signals for initiating this, and have a wonderful rest of the day.